What if history took a different turn? What if during World War II, instead of fighting Germany and Japan, the United States suddenly went to war with Iran? Two nations, one rapidly rising superpower, one strategically located country sitting on some of the most valuable oil fields in the world. In the 1940s, America was building the largest war machine in human history. Factories were producing thousands of aircraft, massive fleets were dominating the oceans, millions of soldiers were preparing to fight across the globe. Meanwhile, Iran was ruled by Reza Shah, a leader determined to modernize his country and strengthen its military. But if these two nations had clashed during the 1940s, who would actually win? Would America's massive industrial power overwhelm Iran instantly? Or could Iran's mountains, deserts, and strategic geography turn the war into a nightmare for the Americans? And most importantly, how powerful were these two countries at that exact moment in history? To answer that question, we need to go back to the early 1940s, because during the World War II, the United States wasn't just another country in the war. It was becoming something much bigger, a global military giant. Factories across the country were running day and night, producing tanks, planes, ships, and weapons at a scale the world had never seen before. Historians later called America the arsenal of democracy. But on the other side of the world, Iran was trying to build a modern army of its own. Under Reza Shah, the country was reforming its military, buying equipment from Europe, and attempting to transform itself into a stronger regional power. But modernization takes time, and the world was already at war. So if the United States and Iran had suddenly become enemies during World War II, would Iran have stood a chance? Or would America's war machine have been simply too powerful to stop? To understand that, we first need to look at America's military power during the war. By the early 1940s, the United States was transforming into the most powerful industrial nation the world had ever seen. When World War II began in 1939, America was not fully involved yet. But once it entered the war in 1941, the country unleashed an industrial machine unlike anything in history. Factories across the nation began producing weapons at an unbelievable pace. Car companies stopped making civilian vehicles and started building tanks and aircraft. Shipyards worked day and night launching massive warships into the oceans. Within just a few years, the United States produced more military equipment than almost any other nation in the war combined. By the end of the war, America had mobilized around 12 million soldiers. Its factories had built over 300,000 military aircraft. Thousands of tanks rolled off production lines, and the United States Navy had become the largest naval force on Earth. Aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, and submarines controlled huge parts of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The United States also had a massive advantage in logistics. It could move troops and equipment across oceans using enormous transport fleets. Few countries in the world could match that kind of global reach. But perhaps the most important advantage was technology. American engineers were constantly developing new weapons, new aircraft, and new military strategies. By 1945, the United States had even developed the world's first nuclear weapon through the Manhattan Project. This level of industrial and technological power made the United States a terrifying opponent for any nation during the war. But while America was becoming a global military giant, what was happening in Iran at the same time? Because under Reza Shah, Iran was also trying to build a stronger and more modern military. The question was, could it ever compete with the enormous power of the United States? In the early 1940s, Iran was far from a global superpower. Its military was small, outdated, and under-equipped compared to the massive forces of the United States. Iran had roughly 126,000 active soldiers, organized into 16 army divisions, but most of its weapons were old, and training was inconsistent. Its air force was tiny, with only a handful of mostly obsolete aircraft. The Navy was minimal, barely able to patrol its own coastlines, and tanks were scarce and outdated. Communication and logistics were another huge problem. Radios were limited, Supply chains were slow, and much of the army wasn't fully motorized. Even though Reza Shah was trying to modernize the country, Iran's military was simply not ready for a confrontation with a major industrialized power like America. The terrain of Iran, mountains, deserts, and vast plateaus, did offer some natural defense. If America had tried a ground invasion, Iranian forces might have used these geographic advantages to slow down the advance. And the country had strategic oil fields that made it valuable for global powers. But geography alone couldn't compensate for the enormous disparity in technology, industrial production, and firepower. History gives us a real example. In 1941, when Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran to secure oil and supply lines, the Iranian army collapsed in just 3 days. This shows just how vulnerable Iran's military was, despite its attempts at modernization. So if we imagine a scenario where the United States went to war with Iran during World War II, the imbalance in power would have been staggering. If a war between the United States and Iran had actually happened in the 1940s, it would have likely started in the air. America's first move would have been to establish air superiority. With hundreds of thousands of planes rolling off production lines, the United States Army Air Forces could have easily overwhelmed Iran's tiny and outdated air force. Airfields across Iran would have been quickly targeted, destroying whatever aircraft remained on the ground. Once the skies were under control, the next step would have been a naval blockade. American aircraft carriers and battleships could have blocked the Persian Gulf, cutting off Iran's oil exports and preventing any outside aid from reaching the country. After dominating the air and sea, America could have launched a ground invasion. Troops could have landed along the southern coast or moved in through neighboring Iraq. While Iran's mountains and deserts might have slowed the advance in some areas, the sheer size, mobility, and firepower of American forces would have been overwhelming. Iran's limited tanks, weak artillery, and lack of modern logistics would have made it nearly impossible to mount an effective defense. Even with massive manpower, the Iranian army would have been at a severe disadvantage against the mechanized and well-coordinated American forces. In this scenario, the war could have been over within weeks or months, far shorter than any of America's campaigns in Europe or the Pacific. The natural strength of Iran, its geography, could only delay the inevitable, not stop it. But Iran did have a few advantages worth mentioning. The country's mountainous terrain and vast deserts could have made certain regions difficult for invading forces to conquer quickly. Guerrilla-style resistance could have slowed down supply lines and caused localized problems for American troops. Iran also had strategic oil fields, which made the region incredibly valuable. Controlling these resources would have been a primary goal for any invading army. And Iran's population, while not fully industrialized, was large enough that mass mobilization could have added manpower to defend the country. Still, these strengths were minor compared to the industrial and technological might of the United States. America could replace lost equipment almost instantly, move forces across oceans with ease, and strike anywhere with precision. Even if Iranian forces held out in some mountain passes, the overall war would have favored America almost immediately. This is not just speculation. History provides a clear lesson. When Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran in 1941, the Iranian army was defeated in just 3 days, and the Shah was forced to abdicate. That was against regional powers, not a global superpower like the United States.